And my project is about capital punishment. My stance on it is that capital punishment is unjust and is a cruel and unusual punishment. We can find better alternatives that will be more suitable for an American justice system. Before I begin my claims, I want to go over what capital punishment is. The textbook definition of capital punishment is the legal authorized killing of someone as punishment for a crime. In America, the main method to execute is lethal injection, where drugs are injected into the person to slowly kill them. There are 28 states who currently practice this type of punishment. My first claim is that the American justice system is inconsistent with the sentences given, and minorities are left to deal with this fault. Research and statistics show that in America, white people get justice through the death penalty more often than black people. The graph shown is an example that not everyone is receiving justice. This graph shows the amount of times that murder was justified based off the victim's skin color. In this case, the victim is a black man killed by a white person, which is 8 times as likely to be justified. Another example also comes from the New York Times, who released an article that provided the statistics that killers of white people are 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death as to killers of African Americans. 80% of capital punishment cases involve a white victim, despite the fact that white victims make up only half of the murder cases. And yes, in a perfect world, there shouldn't have to be any murder cases at all, but we don't live in a world like that. In the year 2002, the disproportion was transparent. The American Civil Liberties released statistics which showed that 178 African American defendants were executed for the murder of white victims, compared to the 12 white defendants executed for the murder of African American victims. This proposes the question that through these inconsistent rulings in our justice system, is it okay to trust our justice system with a life? My second claim is that the capital punishment does not fit well in America because it goes against our constitutional rights, specifically the 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendment. Let's start off with the 5th Amendment, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. We will focus on what due process of law is. It is defined as the fair treatment through the normal judicial system, especially as a citizen's entitlement. With that being said, if you remember my last claim and statistics that show the bias within our system, we know that there is not fair treatment in the judicial system. Now, if we look at the first God-given right, which is life, we see that capital punishment is taking away a life without the proper due process of law. To go along with this idea of fair treatment, we must look at class. By that I mean the rich versus the poor. For example, someone who ends up on death row may not have the money to hire the best lawyers or may not be educated about their rights. This will negatively impact their case compared to someone who's very rich in money and educated about how the justice system works. Taking away a life due to the fact that they might not have the resources to properly present their case is wrong. My last reason is that capital punishment denies a person due process of law, because as new technology comes, there may be more opportunities to prove innocent for a person who's in jail. But if that person were to be killed through this penalty, they will never get to make the chance to make a case. Now moving on to the 14th Amendment. This amendment is almost identical to the 5th Amendment, except at the end the 14th Amendment says nor to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This means that despite differences, everyone must be treated the same when their situations are equal. Once again, with the statistics shown in my previous claim, we know that this is not the case. The last amendment we will talk about is the 8th Amendment, which states that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. We will be focusing on the last part of this amendment, which talks about cruel and unusual punishment. This last part was put into place so that Congress is unable to oppress people through their new power of punishing federal crimes. Many people were worried that this new power would justify something like torture to force a confession and use it against the defendant, such as they were doing in other countries. Well, this fear became a reality in many modern-day cases. Although torture may not be blatantly used, but the use of psychological techniques and interrogation can torture the defendant's mind into a false confession. In the next slide, we'll talk about a few cases where the amendments were violated. In our first case, we'll be talking about Alfred Dwayne Brown, who was convicted in the year 2003 and sentenced to death, but was later exonerated by an attorney named Kim Ogg. She stated that he was wrongfully convicted because a prosecutor broke a law or code during the prosecution process. Brown was convicted for the killing of a store clerk and a police officer. Brown's alibi was that he was at his girlfriend's house during the time of the shooting. In front of a jury, Brown's girlfriend vouched for him, saying that he even called her from the house phone during the time of the shooting. but his girlfriend later changed her testimony after being threatened by the prosecutor. He put her into jail, and he said that she would lose her children if she didn't comply. In 2011, Brown's attorney pushed to re-interview Brown's girlfriend, where she confessed about this experience and signed an affidavit that recanted her testimony. In 2013, homicide detectives found phone records in a police officer's garage which showed he was at her house during the killing of the clerk and police officer. In Brown's case, the Eighth Amendment was violated, which almost caused an innocent man to be put to death. There were many more similar cases to Brown's case, but our next case will focus more on the Fifth and Eighth Amendment. Clifford Williams is a prime example for allowing due process of law to occur. If Williams were to have stopped fighting and been put to death before his wrongful 42-year sentence, then the world would have never known about his innocence. Williams was convicted for first-degree murder and attempted murder of his neighbors despite having 45 eyewitnesses that said he was at a party during the murder. During trial, Williams' counsel was not the best, and they did not bring any evidence to defend his case. The trial ended with Williams being sentenced to life by the jury, but the judge overrode this decision and decided death would be a better sentence for Williams. As for Williams, he never stopped fighting, and the Conviction Integrity Unit, established in 2018, a unit that worked to prevent and identify false convictions, was able to help him start pushing for different motions, and when they looked at ballistic reports, it was confirmed that Williams could not have been the killer. If this new unit had not come up, Williams may still be on death row, losing hope and possibly getting his lethal injection. After being exonerated, he stated that there are too many innocent people on death row, many who have lost hope and could not stick it out in order to have the opportunity of proper due process of law. Imagine if these innocent people never got exonerated. Proper justice would have never been served. There have been 172 exonerated since 1973, and since 1976, 1,516 people have been executed. This brings up another question. Is it okay to sacrifice a possibly innocent life in order to go through with killing someone who commits a cruel crime? My final claim is that the death penalty does not deter crime, and there are better alternatives that would be more cost-efficient and would suit America's justice system a lot better. According to Amnesty International, the median cost of the death penalty in 2008 was $1.26 million compared to the $740,000 for a life sentence without parole. Now, why is the death penalty very expensive? This is because many people on death row don't have the money to pay for their own attorney. Therefore, they must use public defenders or state-appointed lawyers. Death penalty cases also take a long time to actually get to trial. During this pretrial time, they use experts to build or defend a concrete case for this inmate. Next, the jury selecting process is very expensive as well. Trial for death penalty is about 4 times longer than non-capital punishment trials. Jurors, attorneys, and court personnel get compensation during this time, which also spikes up the cost. These costs are covered by taxpayers' dollars. Capital punishment does not lower crime rates. The New York Times found that in the last 20 years, states with the death penalty have a homicide rate of 48% to 101% higher than in states without the death penalty. This goes to show that having the death penalty does not decrease crime rates throughout states. For example, let's look at the crime rate in New York and Florida. I chose these 2 states to examine because they are relatively close in population. New York is a state that does not use capital punishment. The total murders that they had in 2018 was 562 compared to Florida, who uses capital punishment, and had a total of 1,107 murders in the year 2018. A better alternative for the death penalty would be life in prison without parole. Life in prison without parole is technically a death sentence, except inmates will die in jail due to natural causes. This sentencing provides the opportunity for people who have been wrongfully convicted to continue fighting for their innocence. Another reason that this sentence could be preferred is because when there is a capital punishment trial, the trials are very long, putting victims and their families through the anxiety of waiting for the next hearing and waiting for what will happen next. When someone is sentenced to life in prison without parole, then their sentencing will start much sooner and victims won't have to relive their traumatic experience. The last reason is this sentencing is a lot cheaper. The money that would be going to death sentencing can instead go into solving more cases, rehabilitation for inmates, and many other different parts of the judicial system. Next, we'll go into Catholic Church's views and beliefs on capital punishment. We'll be looking at what the Church itself says and an interpretation of the Church's idea from our very own religion teacher, Mr. Simon. The Catholic Church is very opposed to the death penalty. The Church believes that human life must be respected and protected from the moment of conception. This concept shouldn't change due to the fact that you have committed a crime. Human life should be respected because human dignity is a virtue in society. Every individual should be respected with the life given, and life has value. Throughout this whole semester, we talked heavily about human dignity. This goes hand in hand with life. We also learned that as Catholics, we must have respect for life. With that being said, the Church works to abolish this penalty due to the fact that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. Mr. Simone, also known as Corey Simone, is a religion teacher here at Marano School. Before asking Mr. Simone about the Catholic Church's view on this topic, I wanted to get to know a little bit about what influences his views. He stated that when talking about political things, religion does influence his decisions and how he views these types of topics. Mr. Simone was also aware of the basics of capital punishment, such as the high costs and the lengthy trials, and in his own personal views, he doesn't agree with this topic. My main focus for interviewing Mr. Simone was to get a better understanding of what the Church has to say about this topic. In this snippet of our interview, Mr. Simone does just that. He breaks down what the Catholic Church says about the death penalty, and he talks about what the Church thinks is a better alternative. These quotes from our interview really stood out to me. The death penalty is not about justice, but it's about revenge. The vengeance is not an adequate justification for punishment, and there are better ways to reconcile for these crimes. Mr. Simone acknowledges the fact that it must be very hard for these victims and their families to turn the other cheek, and if he were in their shoes, he would be very torn with how to proceed. But overall, Mr. Simone, who is influenced by his religious views, believes that the death penalty should be abolished, and we should adapt a different type of punishment, such as manual labor. Now we'll look into the seven social teachings of the Catholic Church and how it relates to this topic. The first one is life and dignity. This relates to capital punishment because human life is sacred and the value of human life is threatened by the death penalty. By allowing this penalty, it shows that if you commit a heinous crime, your life doesn't matter and it'll be taken. Next is call to family, community, and participation. This is related to capital punishment because how we organize our society, which includes politics and laws we keep in place, directly affects our human dignity. We must seek the common good and well-being of all, including vulnerable. The people on death row are very vulnerable due to the fact that they don't have much say, therefore we must advocate for them. Rights and responsibility is related to capital punishment because every human has a right to life. Once again, we must protect the vulnerable despite their actions to achieve a healthy community. This will also help to teach our duties to each other as a whole. Option for the poor and vulnerable is related to capital punishment due to the fact that we should be putting the needs of the poor and vulnerable first. In this case, people on death row are getting their fundamental right of life taken away. Therefore, we must promote a different option to serve justice to the victims without violating an inmate's right. Solidarity is the pursuit of happiness, peace, and justice, meaning that if we want peace, we must work for justice. God calls us to create peace in a world that is filled with violence. Capital punishment creates more violence by purposely taking away a life when there are other options. By us keeping this practice in place, we are adding to the violence that someone on death row may have created. Care for God's creation is related to the death penalty because in the Catholic belief, all life is precious and we must protect those people on the planet. Therefore, by using capital punishment instead of life in prison without parole, we are not protecting an inmate's life. Next is the importance of natural law and our call to act as humans, which I will be relating to the death penalty. First, the meaning of natural law is the moral knowledge that is written in every human heart. It is universal, permanent, and unchanging. We as Catholic humans, are called to act when we see injustices happen through natural law. Capital punishment is something that we must act upon due to the fact that it is taking a life in the Catholic faith. The Most High God is the only one that should have a say when a person has fulfilled their reason for being on earth. My hopes for the future is that we get the perfect utopian system that is not biased and gives the proper justice to victims. I don't think that the use of capital punishment right now is worth it due to the amount of people who are found innocent within these cases and had to suffer long years in jail due to the unfairness the system holds. The statistics show that having this system in place has a lot of negative aspects to it, and although there are some positive, I believe that the negative surely outweighs due to the fact that there are many more options that will prevent a killer to walk freely. And here's my works cited. And that's it. Thank you for listening to my project. Is there any questions?